Happy Frazetta Friday. I'm Sara, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls. In this one, I'm covering a topic that doesn't get talked about as much, yet it might be the very thing that introduced millions of people to Frazetta's art. Tonight, we're talking record albums. Vinyl, big, bold, unforgettable album covers with Frank Frazetta paintings front and center. Though phonographs and records have been around in one form or another for over 125 years, the albums themselves, whether made of tin or shellac or vinyl or tape or eventually discs, originally came in brown paper sleeves with a hole in the middle that showed a label on the record with the artist's name and the songs included. As the format grew in popularity, those blank sleeves were replaced with colorful jackets featuring art or photographs to help attract customers. But in the 1920s and 30s, buying music to play at home was still something of a luxury, and the most popular way to listen to music, other than in person, was the radio, since the sound was much better than what was possible with the early phonographs. Beginning in the early 1940s, the main market for records were jukebox owners who would place their coin-operated record players and all the music that came with them in bars and restaurants that were sometimes known as juke joints. The establishments would get a small percentage of whatever money the loud and flashy machines generated when their owners came by each week to empty them of nickels and dimes and add new songs. By the late 1950s, a lot of the World War II and Cold War technology and materials were being turned into affordable, quality home products. Inexpensive portable record players were eventually followed in the 1960s by stereos and hi-fis with giant speakers and subwoofers, as the baby boomers embraced rock and roll and bought singles, commonly called 45s because of the turntable speed, and long playing albums by their favorite singers and bands to play whenever they wanted. Packaging became much more important for sales and could help new performers find an audience. Early on, most covers featured pin-up style photos, but they quickly evolved into more conceptual, expressive, and exciting imagery, particularly for rock performers. For a time, every town and city had a small record store, and quite a few were run either by the mob, who in previous decades had been the main owners of jukeboxes, or hippies, or sometimes both. The shops were jammed to capacity with racks of albums priced at several dollars a piece and attracted crowds of young buyers. Album covers were hugely important marketing tools as well as an influence on popular culture. From the 1960s through the 1990s, creating record jackets were among the most lucrative jobs for illustrators, photographers, and graphic designers. The major studios were paying anywhere from $1,000 to $4,000 or more, depending on the label and the musician, so it's no surprise that virtually everybody who was anybody was doing a jacket cover. Roger Dean, Drew Struzan, Don Punchatz, Alberto Vargas, and even Norman Rockwell all painted wonderful and unforgettable album covers in their careers. My grandpa began producing art for record jackets as an extension of his painting movie posters. Everyone might remember that Frank's portrait of Beatles drummer Ringo Starr for a shampoo ad parody that ran on the back cover of Mad Magazine number 90 in 1964 led directly to the commission for What's New Pussycat film poster in 1965. That art also became Frazetta's first album cover when it was used for the soundtrack released by United Artists Records. As I've mentioned in a previous episode, the movie studios purchased both the originals and the copyrights for the posters and would use the art for any products like books, records, without paying additional fees, which, again, since they were already paying 10 times more than he was making painting paperback covers, Frank was perfectly happy with that arrangement. Soundtracks for After the Fox, Hotel Paradiso, The Night They Raided Minsky's, Yours, Mine, and Ours, Fitzwilly, and others also featured his poster art. Virtually all of my grandfather's film posters in the 1960s were for comedies, and he quickly became pigeonholed as a humor artist, which, though he liked the money, didn't thrill him. Jim Silk, who was the art director for Capitol Records, was paying attention to which soundtracks were selling and called up Wally Wood to find out how he could get in touch with Frazetta. Wood replied simply, "He's in the phone book, look him up." Silk promptly called Frank and commissioned him to create characters of various politicians for the comedy albums by Earl Dowd and Alan Robin. Welcome to the LBJ Ranch, Lyndon Johnson's Lonely Hearts Club, and Score 3 Points. The art was combined with photos by a graphic designer. Though he was paid well, Frazetta never cared for the work and forgot about them almost as soon as he was finished. But as it turned out, my grandfather would collaborate again with Silk on a series of death dealer novels for Tor Books some years later, which I'll discuss more fully in a future episode of Frazetta Fridays. In 1966, Jonathan Winters was one of America's most successful comics. He appeared in many films, hosted his own TV variety show for several years, and released a number of albums featuring his stand-up comedy routines. Verve Records gave Frazetta $3,000 to paint multiple caricatures of Winters as different characters for the jacket for Movies Are Better Than Ever, and it became a huge seller. That same year, MGM's Both Sides of Herman's Hermits became the only rock-pop album that he ever specifically produced new art for. That art, too, was humorous in its approach, and the record sold extremely well. Even though Jack Davis created the actual movie poster for Paramount's Western comedy Waterhole No. 3 in 1967, Frazetta was proving to be so popular that Smash Records hired him to paint a portrait of singer Roger Miller to include on the soundtrack sleeve along with Davis's poster art. Grandpa said, "It was nuts. I think they gave me something like $1,000 to do Miller's face, and it only took me a little over an hour, if that. If they wanted to throw stupid amounts of money at me, I wasn't gonna complain." But as it often happened throughout his career, he got bored with the assignments, and regardless of the stupid amounts of money being offered, he stopped doing album covers after completing the assignment for Waterhole No. 3 and turned down any new jobs, though his movie poster art continued to appear on the soundtrack records. Kama Sutra Records was a small label distributed by MGM, and in 1972, their freelance art director, David Krieger, called my grandma to try to commission Frazetta to paint a jacket for the rock band Dust. Grandma immediately told him, "We're not interested." But before she could hang up, he quickly asked, what if they paid to use a painting that already existed? And you know, I can imagine my grandma standing in her kitchen with the phone to her ear as the light bulb clicked on over her head. At the time, most illustrations didn't really have a life beyond their original purpose. They were somehow attached to whatever book or magazine they had been done for, and it was generally believed that reusing them would somehow cause confusion. Plus, in those days, most publishers behaved like movie studios and claimed ownership of the copyrights and often the originals for all of the art they commissioned. It was all theirs to keep and use or not use as they chose, so there was something of a hands-off attitude when it came to one company reprinting illustrations that had first been published by someone else. For his part, Frazetta didn't generally care what publishers thought. As I mentioned in the past, beginning in the mid-1960s, my grandpa insisted on retaining ownership of his originals, and except for film posters, never contractually signed away any rights for any of that work. He believed that he owned whatever he painted, and the people responded to the art, not because it depicted Conan or John Carter or any other fictional character, because of the art itself, his art. And he was right. My grandparents had already asserted their ownership of the paintings and dipped their toe into the licensing pond with their deal with Ken Sanders for the first World Beater posters, featuring 2 Conan covers, 2 Warren covers, and the cover for Brock the Barbarian versus the Sorceress. None of his original clients had objected or challenged Frazetta's rights to his work. Subsequently, the poster business was a tremendous success, especially when my grandma took it over. So when Kama Sutra suggested that they enter into a non-exclusive license to use the cover to Conan of Samaria for the Dust album cover, my grandma thought, why not? She quoted Krieger a fee of $1,000, over double of what Frank had originally been paid to paint the cover for Lancer Books, and was a little surprised at how quickly he said yes. When asked about it several years later, my grandma shook her head saying, I should have charged more. Gene Simmons was a Frazetta fan and loved his early covers for Creepy. He tried to hire him in 1976 to paint the jacket for the 4th Kiss studio album, Destroyer, but my grandpa wasn't interested. Simmons eventually commissioned Ellie's cousin and then current Creepy cover artist, Ken Kelly, to create the art instead. In 1977, my grandma was approached by A&M Records, who wanted to license Frank's cover for Eerie No. 8, aka The Brain, to use as the jacket for the Scottish band Nazareth's album, Expect No Mercy. Grandma thought for a minute and then quoted a fee of $2,000. Which they instantly agreed to. And naturally, her first thought was, I should have charged more. In 1978, the art director for Epic Records called asking if they could use my grandfather's Death Dealer painting from the 1974 paperback Flashing Swords No. 2 for their debut studio album by the southern rock band Molly Hatchet. Without missing a beat, my grandmother said, sure, for $2,500. And just as quickly, Epic said, sure. Which of course made her feel once again, I should have charged more. Whether it was the band, the music, the Death Dealer cover art, the zeitgeist of the era, or a combination of all four that made the album a big hit is a matter of opinion. But whatever the reason, Molly Hatchet went platinum and introduced 1 million people to the art of Frank Frazetta. When Epic called again to ask if they could license the paperback cover art from the 1976 Carl Edward Wagner novel Dark Crusade for the band's second album, Grandma was ready and told the art director the price is now $4,000. This time, there was some hesitancy at the fee, but after talking it over, crunching the numbers, and getting approval from their parent company, Columbia Records, they agreed, and Frazetta's painting Dark Kingdom appeared on Molly Hatchet's Flirtin' with Disaster in 1979. The response was enormous. Flirtin' with Disaster not only went double platinum, selling 2 million albums in the United States, but it also sold 50,000 copies in Canada as well. A whole new generation of fans were excitedly paying attention to this Frazetta guy. For Hatchet's third album in 1980, Beatin' the Odds, Epic licensed Grandpa's 1967 cover painting for Conan the Conqueror, again for $4,000. It too went platinum, but it turned out to be Frazetta's final cover for the band. In 1981, Epic tried to commission my grandfather to paint the band as fantasy warriors for their fourth album, Take No Prisoners, but despite increasing their offer to over $5,000, he turned them down flat. He thought it was a dumb idea and no amount of money would change his mind. Boris Vallejo was eventually commissioned to paint that jacket. For a time, that was pretty much it as far as Frazetta album covers went. And with all things, times changed, marketing, branding, and the delivery of content moved in other directions, and the labels found different ways to spend their money. Vinyl records were replaced in popularity by cassette tapes, and then compact discs, then various streaming options. Though vinyl has returned of something of a niche market for purists in recent years, it's not a big business like it once was, and fees for any cover art, new or licensed, are much, much smaller now. In 2003, one of Frank's left-handed pencil drawings was used for the CD Dead LV Buddy Bought the Farm, while in the mid-2000s, the Australian band Wolfmother began licensing his paintings to use as covers for various albums. Because of the huge popularity of those Molly Hatchet albums, I have frequently been asked if my grandpa hung out with the bands or if he even liked rock and roll. And the simple answer to both questions is no. All of his assignments came from the art directors, and my grandma handled the negotiations from the 1970s on. He never had any interactions with any of the musicians. In the 1990s, Glenn Danzig published the book Frazetta Illustrations Arcanum, as well as comics featuring Death Dealer. And though my grandpa personally liked Glenn a great deal, he never listened to his music either. Rock simply just didn't interest him. Now that we're speaking music, what did he listen to? Well, remember that my grandfather was born in 1928. He was a child of the Great Depression, and he grew up during the big band era. In the 1940s and 1950s, he listened to the crooners like Bing Crosby, Perry Como, and most especially Frank Sinatra, of whom he remained a fan of his entire life. In fact, when he was in his early 20s, my grandpa once stood in a crowd of fans outside of a theater where Sinatra was giving a concert. As Sinatra passed, my grandpa called to him and handed the singer a portrait he had drawn. Supposedly, Sinatra flashed his trademark smile and said, "Very nice, thanks, kid," before entering the theater with his portrait in hand. And I do wonder what happened to that drawing. In the 1960s and 70s, my grandfather would listen to a baseball game on the radio or TV while he worked. But at night, when he painted, he would play classical music, including operas. Now, according to his sisters, his nephew, my mom, and even my grandpa had an absolutely beautiful voice. He would sing along to Frank Sinatra, and everyone listening said you really couldn't tell the two apart. When my grandparents married in 1956, my grandpa sang a medley of Sinatra's love songs to my grandma in front of an appreciative crowd during their wedding reception. I have many memories of my grandparents, but there's one that I wish I had that I don't have. I never heard my grandpa sing. If I did, I was too young to remember it. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. I'm Sarah, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls.